So last but not least, we have Michael Coté here with us. And I just wanted to say howdy and, all that stuff. But then 5 minutes ago, we just realized that you are in Amsterdam. Michael, how are you? And Michael, we don't hear you.
Oh, hey, sorry. Yeah, you can still say that. I'm actually from Texas. I just live here. So, it still applies. I remember what things were like.
All right, all right. So let me a little bit introduce you, okay? So Michael Focus studies how large organizations get better at building software to run better and grow their business. You are also a co-host of several podcasts, including a software-defined talk. Sorry, it's the last day and you're the last speaker. So today we're going to hear lessons learned from running developer platforms and communities. A little bit about the topic. So developers love building their own stacks, but that causes problems, especially in the large organizations. Building this platform and getting developers to actually use it is the most frequent challenge, but there are more best practice and worst practice as well. This talk collects together these lessons learned from many different organizations over the past 5 years. Some topics are onboarding developers, marketing and branding, security, and product managing the platform. Michael, so the virtual stage is yours.
Well, great. Thanks for having me, first of all, and that allows me to not summarize the talk I was going to give. That's and also reminds me what I was going to talk about. So that's always handy. Well, just to give a little bit of additional introduction, that's me there, as you can tell. And as mentioned, I spend a lot of time thinking about how organizations can get better at software. I write things up in books every now and then, but it really is. I'll get into part of it, but I'm always interested in three things. That is, how people are actually doing software differently, how they're developing it, product managing it, doing kind of like the iterative process of improving the software. And of course, the software is what they use to run and operate their business, whether it's kind of an external facing thing, whether it's a store or, online banking or whatever else, refilling a prescription, government related things. But then there's also inward facing software that people use, not sort of in a psychological way, but software that they use to run their organization internally. And then I'm also interested in how people run that software, because software that is not running well isn't very useful. It's kind of a bummer. And then finally, kind of at a management or executive layer, I really am interested in the processes that people use, the norms they follow, their organization structure. Some people call a lot of this stuff culture, which is cool, but I always like to get a bit more specific in a organizational structure, what that is. Anyways, if you want to look up some of this stuff, I should really add an S to that HTTP. I know people like a secure connection, but if someone's tracking what you're downloading from my site, it's probably fine. They'll just think much better of you. But enough about me. So this talk, as mentioned, goes over a lot of lessons learned and best practices when it comes to a little bit nowadays what's going under the name of platform engineering. Now, this has had different names over the years. I don't know, all the way back to as far as I can remember, when you would think I used to be a enterprise Java developer, if you know what that is. And we had something called an application server, which was this big platform that developers would write their stuff and run it in, and it had all your middleware. And since then, I guess that's the late 90s, early 2000s, there's been many, many evolutions of what a platform is. And like I was saying, the practices that are used to run it, how people use it, the governance that you use, things like that. And I think starting about back in, I don't know, let's say summer or so, the phrase that people have been using to describe this has been platform engineering. And there's many other names that it's gone by in kind of the community that I'm in, which is the Cloud Foundry, the Pivotal community now at the VMware Tanzu sort of world, where we've got things like Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes and all the stacks of stuff built on that. We've called that concept platform as a product for a while. The as a product part, as we'll get into, being very key, but you can call it whatever you like, right? It's always of interest. And I think especially now, I think there's three reasons why it's especially interesting. And The first is that it is a successful way to run applications, and I think a lot of that is driven by what I would call the dream of how people want to do software. And I'll just tell you very briefly what this looks like. And I like to start with this thing that doesn't really have anything to do with how you operate or run a platform, anything to do with how you run the infrastructure part, your sort of Kubernetes stuff, but it's purely focused on the application developers, which, as you'll see, becomes a bit of the point, right? And this is an example from an organization from a few years ago, and they had achieved this ideal way of using software to run their organization. And it was a food services company, which means they deliver food around, but they also will run your kitchens, your commercial kitchens, like a big kitchen at like a university, maybe a corporate campus, things like that. And what they wanted to do, and it starts with something that's very non-software, right? It starts with the business motivations. And this is a commercial way of doing things. You can think in a government, a government has a duty or obligation or the pleasure of providing citizens to services, right? But think about whatever goal that organization has, whatever they're doing. But in this case, running commercial kitchens, what the organization wanted to do is, like most organizations, they wanted to optimize on costs so that they could make more money. And they also wanted to improve the customer experience, right? Have a good business that their customers liked. And being a kitchen, what they wanted to focus on was consistency of the food that they were preparing, right? So if you can imagine in a large commercial kitchen like this, you spend a lot of time coming up with the ideal menu, the ideal way of preparing it, that is both consistent for customers, that it's the same all the time, and that it's good for customers, that is people like you and me who eat it. And also that it doesn't cost too much, that you can control the cost of it so you as a business can be profitable. So of course, their first idea when it came to addressing these goals with software was that, well, clearly we need to move from our paper recipes to a tablet because that, using a tablet is going to solve our problems. Using software is going to solve the issues. Now, I'm being a little snide about it, but, it does seem like a legitimate thing to think that digitizing your recipe book would be more beneficial. So the team of product developers, the product team, they, instead of just taking those requirements and doing what they were told, which certainly seems like something people like to do. I certainly appreciate that, having 3 kids and a dog that I manage. Anytime someone does what they're told, it seems like a great victory that we've had here in the house. But in this case, what the team did, because they were following this ideal way of software, and because they had in place everything else that I'll go over in this talk, is they were able to go into the kitchen very early in the morning and stay there for several hours for about a week and observe what all the people, the users, were doing. The users being the people inside the kitchen, the staff in there. And they found that what the kitchen staff ended up doing a lot of was running around and measuring raw chicken and measuring mayonnaise, measuring the temperature of all of these things that you can't let go below a certain temperature for a certain amount of time. Otherwise, you introduce the risk of food poisoning or worse, which is certainly not going to help your customer experience and might damage your profitability as far as like your service being renewed if you're known to not be very good and cause people to have a bad time, as it were. But also, this took up a huge amount of time. So to wrap up what could be a long story, instead of delivering on that initial piece of software, this team was able to think about their software as a product and not just deliver to a set of features, but to iteratively go through and discover how they could write software to help the business achieve its goals, to help its users, the staff, work better. And so they had a theory that if they automated and they kind of wrapped some software around all that measuring, and it would speed it up, removing the time that people took to do it, freeing up time to focus on other things. But it would also improve the quality of the metrics of gathering those metrics. And this means that it would be easier to pass audits and governance, when a food inspector comes in, and also more accurate in what the measurements were, remembering when to do them. This is very analogous to like how you seek to automate the process that you have with IT or programming, right? The more that you automate something and standardize it, the more successful you tend to be. So this way, again, there was a lot of software development involved in this, going through a process of discovering and the best way to implement the software. But getting to this point where you have the time to go discover what to do, where on about a weekly or every 2 weekly base, a 2 weeks basis, you can test out new features and new approaches and make sure that your software is doing what's most helpful, that you're even targeting the right problem. This is the ideal state that most organizations want to get to with software. Now, maybe everyone listening to this is already in this ideal state. You're delivering software every week. Things are going great. Your developers have time to spend on that instead of the stack of infrastructure things. And if that's the case, maybe you can help out your friends who don't seem so upset when you go visit with them, or who do seem upset when you visit with them, kind of help them move them along this area. Now, I think a second thing that is getting people interested in platform engineering to a large degree is our friend here, Kubernetes. Now, this is of interest because surveys show us, and anecdotally, you get to this, most every organization I talk with is very interested in standing up Kubernetes. I was just talking with many infrastructure people this past week at our big conference, VMware Explore, down there in Barcelona. And about every team of infrastructure people I talked with said that they have a Kubernetes install program in place. Maybe they're even along the way. And this has been going on for, I would say in the mainstream for the last couple of years. There's been people interested in standing up Kubernetes to run their cloud infrastructure to support, architectures that are container-based. But I think now that we're kind of like a little bit in the beginning, people have stood this up. They're sort of like moving their developers over to use it. I think what they're discovering is that for as great as Kubernetes is, once you get it up and running and once you have applications on it, for as many benefits as it has, which are there's a lot of them, what you get when you stand up your Kubernetes environment is you get this. You just get a blinking cursor, or as older people like to say, including myself, a dial tone, which I try not to say that too much because I realize that most people were probably born in the last 15 or 20 years have no idea what a dial tone is. You can look it up in Wikipedia. It was a fun device, a good status sort of thing that you would hear in your ear of all places. But what you get with Kubernetes is something that's ready to be used, ready to have, I would argue, a platform built on top of it. And I think that's another reason why there's so much interest in platforms out there, is because we're now at the state where we've got this blinking cursor. And now organizations who have stood this up are looking to have some value, some great use come out of Kubernetes. And instead of, as one person said when I was talking with them this week, an infrastructure person, instead of opening up the floodgates to just have the developers come in and use Kubernetes and do whatever they want, you want to put in place a technology, a stack, and a set of practices. Now, you don't necessarily want to tell application developers this, but you want to put in some governance. So that you can actually operate the applications that they have well, and also for the benefit of developers, so that they don't have to reinvent over and over again the stack of software between Kubernetes and their actual applications that handles everything for them, the way to package and configure things, the way to instrument things so that they can be monitored into production, all of these things that are a platform, as we'll get into. Now, thankfully, and this is what I'm going to go over with the rest, right? There are many cases over the past 5, even 7 years, where organizations have been in this situation, maybe not with Kubernetes at the bottom, but definitely with container-based architectures. And they have had success building a platform and building, more importantly, well, equally importantly, as I'll get into, a platform team. And this is just one example of that, of what JP Morgan Chase, big global bank, the kind of success they've had with their platform teams. And you can see they've got a couple of different platforms here. But just to pull out one figure, right? So they are at the moment, and this is about maybe a little under a year ago, they've been running about 1,500 applications on this platform, following a lot of the practices that I'll go over. So that it works, right? If you know what a platform is, you architect it well, you start following the practices. And vitally, as we'll see for JP Morgan Chase, you have a role called a platform advocate, which is pretty fun, but you do the kind of community management around a platform. You can have a tremendous amount of success with platforms beyond that blinking cursor. So the first question to get to is asking, what is a platform, right? So before we get into that, and what a platform is isn't always the same exact thing. It can mean sort of different things. But as with most technology stuff like this, you're generally solving for the same different problems. And so when you make a diagram of something, you generally end up with the same sorts of things. Now, one good approach looking at this, and this is built on well, it's not built on, it's from an analysis that Gartner did on a very related concept called an internal developer portal, which I would argue platforms sort of is part of what a platform is. But you can see that the various things that a platform solves for, right, there's nothing new that they're doing necessarily. But the thing that's new is grouping these things together and thinking about how you're solving each of those issues in a more integrated way. And there's also a little bit more new in the idea of an internal developer platform that I won't necessarily go into much, especially when it comes to the community angle and kind of, if you think about it, the intranet for a developer. But if you're interested in digging into more of that, you can check out the paper. I realize you can't click on the link down there below, but eventually you can get to it somewhere. But from a more technical angle, this is a diagram that we use. There's all sorts of other diagrams out there, but I think this one is pretty good. What you can kind of see a platform is, right, is that it starts with the infrastructure at the bottom, right? Like no matter how hard we try, we still need servers, networking, and compute. And electricity is good too, and all the wires and cables, right? So you need some kind of infrastructure, whether it's your own, whether it's public cloud, whatever it may be. And then typically you have I guess you would call it a container as a service layer, although I haven't heard that phrase in a long time. But you have, whether it's a Kubernetes or a Cloud Foundry, or you've built your own thing, kind of chosen your own adventure, you have this layer that sits on top of the infrastructure and manages the orchestration of the containers, how the various containers talk with each other, the service meshes for enforcing security and networking there, like all this kind of lower level stuff from an application developer perspective that it's not really geared towards the application developers. It achieves that blinking cursor. And then as you go up the stack, you can see all of the other components, the general components that you have in a platform. And I think one of the key understandings of this, that those people like JP Morgan Chase and Mercedes and other people I'll go oversee, is that you're not just providing that infrastructure, you're not just providing a set of middleware or backing services, but you're thinking about how the tools that developers use, the build tool chains, are fitting into what they're doing, right? You're looking at the system as a whole, the system that it takes for someone to think of an idea, for developers to write it, for them to package it up and plan out how it's going to run in production, all the way to running to production, right? And this is a key insight of what it means to do platform as a product or platform engineering, is the scope that infrastructure and operations people are looking at grows to include the systems, the tools that developers use to actually get their software out the door, right? And a lot of the, whether you want to call it middleware or services or backing services that are used there, this is all wrapped up in what it is to be a platform. And once you can integrate that stuff together and make it work together, that's where you sort of achieve, or not sort of, that's where you achieve a lot of the advantages, for example, that you saw from the bank previously, and other advantages that we saw, the benefits, if you will. So there's a key insight about platform as a product or platform engineering or whatever you want to call it that I like to call out specifically. And I want to call this out because as I go through the rest of the things, I might go back to it as a reminder, but always think about this principle, right? And it is why, as I was going over, when you're doing platform engineering, you're thinking in a platform way, why you're focusing on more than just the infrastructure, more than just the containers, more than just Kubernetes. You're focusing on that entire system of integrated things that people do. And that is because you're thinking about your platform as a product. Now, I've always worked at software vendors, so I know very intimately what it means to think about your software as a product. And the first thing that you learn when you're thinking about your software as a product is that you need a customer. If there's no customer for your product, then you're not going to exist very long. And in this case, the customer that you have, if you're building and running a platform, are developers, right? The developers are the ones that are using the platform. The developers are the primary ones that the platform is benefiting for. They're the reason the platform exists. And therefore, just like you would do at a software vendor or a public cloud or whatever you want to think of it, you as the owner and the builder of that platform are always thinking about what can I do to help the developers out the most, to help my customers out the most? And that's a very different way of looking at what you're doing with even a platform in the older versions of it, but doing with infrastructure and operations, where typically what you're doing is you're delivering a set of services. You're delivering something. You're not doing this continuous flow of product management and improving it. And like the people in the kitchen, studying what works and what makes your customers, your developers' lives better, right? So there's nothing wrong with service delivery. That's really great, kind of the lower down the stack you go, because you're kind of just delivering to, your SLAs and uptime. You're delivering to just something working, which is a wonderful attribute of software to have. But at this platform layer, you're really focusing on that customer. And I know I'm overemphasizing it, but as I go through this, think about how things change, how your thinking changes when you're thinking about a developer, the product team as the customers that you have. So now let's spend the rest of the time looking at two things. One is, this is not going to be an exhaustive list because we all need to get on with our lives, especially on a Friday afternoon here. But let's look at what I think are some of the more important things to think about when you're putting together your platform strategy, your plan. You're kind of building the program for how you're doing your platform and your platform engineering, platform as a product, whatever you want to call it. And going back, this is a more or less, let's call it maximal list of things that people start doing, and a bit of the tools kind of joined up with those diagrams. This is from the guy, Nadi at JP Morgan Chase, who that previous slide is from. This is actually a great talk. It's only about, let's say 7 minutes worth of, or not worth of, 7 minutes or so of direct content on this. The other stuff, like any talk, is introductory stuff, throat clearing, talking about who they are. But it's a very brief overview of how they've been doing platform engineering. But there's this great list in here of kind of the common practices, right? And again, if you look through these and you go, watch that talk as homework, if you like being assigned homework, you can see that there's very technical things, right? Like everything needs to be self-service and therefore automated, right? And this kind of notion leads to a lot of things of, it's better to have a chat interface. I guess you could call it chat ops. I don't know if people still say that. But a lot of, for example, in that area, one of the technical things people often do is they try to move from ticketing systems to chat-based systems for support, right? So all sorts of technical things like that, to focusing on the pipeline that you have, but also, again, that customer focus that people have. So again, if you want to kind of dig into a lot more things that I'll skip over, there's plenty of stuff to get into, and that presentation is a good start. So the first thing I think that's important to kind of focus on, which I've been sort of implicit about, but I think for many organizations, it's good to have a way of thinking about this, because I see a lot of organizations following the worst practice version of this. And that is that when it comes to building and running your platform, in general, it's a terrible idea to let your application developers do it. And in general, most people do this, right? So at least they do it at first. So you remember me mentioning that I was talking with someone this week, some infrastructure people, and they had set up a Kubernetes environment, and they were nervous about just letting the application developers come and start using it, right? As to use their words, they didn't want to open the floodgates to all these different developers. Now, their concern, being infrastructure people, even though they were kind enough not to say it this way, is that the developers would come in and not know what they were doing enough and set up all sorts of crazy things that maybe worked for the developers that were setting it up, but that long term, when the infrastructure people had to support it, when the developers were like, I don't know, got bored or moved on and started asking for help to help run the infrastructure stuff, now these infrastructure people would be stuck with it, right? So from an operations person standpoint, you'd like to be able to help the application developers with your expertise. It's not like they're coming to ask you how to, perfectly do, as an infrastructure person, like do their work, do the UIs and kind of user-centric design stuff that they have, things like that. Everyone has their own expertise. Now, on the developer side, what I see happen over and over again is that developers who go build these platforms and run them on their own, they end up spending way too much of their time doing that. And if you think about it, again, think about this product mentality of a platform, right? So like building any product, you're going to have to spend a lot of time planning what you're doing. And if you think about it, there's tons of options out there, many duplicative options, many options that are in various states of development, all sorts of things like that. So you're going to have to think about what's in the platform, test out various things, integrate them together, probably iterate through a few different ways of doing it. So you've got a lot of things to do just to get to day one, right, of building that platform. Then the developers or whoever's building this platform is going to have to ongoing integrate it with the rest of the environment you have, right? Things, whether it's basic things like logging people in an identity, making sure that your customers can access this, handling the customer data you have, the databases, interfacing with the ERP systems you have to get inventory, all these various things that are custom to your organization that you can't just sort of download and start using. And then ongoing, right, as you need more things in that platform, you're going to need a product manager who's going to be able to prioritize what features you have in there, how to evolve the things. I mean, you also have to fix the bugs and the things that don't work. And then, to use an example from one of my teammates back when he used to work at Garmin, the map people. Also, you might decide that you want to enter a brand new regional market or several new regional markets, and you're going to have to adapt your platform and your policies to fit in that new part of the world that you're doing. So there's this ongoing just adding features and taking care of the thing. Plus, there's also the funding to worry about, right? Like you probably are going to end up, paying for things here and there, if not just the infrastructure. You might even decide to buy a few things. You might hire some people for it, and someone's going to have to pay for that. And even though they tend to be the focal point and stars of what they do a lot, the application developers don't always have a lot of funding versus the infrastructure people. I don't know if you've seen infrastructure people's budget, but it's often staggeringly massive because if you think about it, they run everything. So they already have a pretty good budget for doing stuff. So you add up all of these different things, and then you go to the application developer and you say, oh, yes, well, also, we'd like that application that you work on. That would be cool if you did that as well. So it starts to become way too much for an application developer to focus on, right? It's something that's overwhelming for them when really you have all these infrastructure and ops people whose job it is to build that stuff. So they generally are the ones, the operations and infrastructure people who have the time, the expertise, the funding, and also the sort of responsibility of doing this work. So in doing that, right? So if you have the right kind of team of people in place, the next thing to look through, and the next thing that I tend to see people fall into is they tend to want to build, people who build stuff, it turns out they like to build stuff. They really enjoy understanding all the pieces and building it from scratch. Now, there's a whole lot of different options out there, right? Like whether they're free, open source, commercial, hosted in public cloud somewhere. There are many, many already built, not only full-on platforms, but components of platforms. And many built practices and architectures, ways of thinking about running platforms. So, in seeing many people try to build their own platforms over the years, what I generally advise people with is start with the assumption that you're just going to take a complete built, integrated, opinionated platform and work backward from there as you discover what your requirements are, right? Instead of realizing at the end that you should have more, let's say, off the shelf, more pre-built components and kind of cleaning up all of the stuff that you had at the beginning. Instead, make architectural decisions that allow you to customize each component as you need it. And no one really builds custom file systems anymore. I know there are some people who do, and few people build networking stacks that are customized anymore. Hopefully people aren't building like string parsers or, scripting, shell script sort of interpreters and things like that. Think about your platform as kind of in the same area, something that you don't necessarily want to build completely on your own, and also the practices that are there. So do a fair amount of research about the platforms that exist there, because to my point earlier, we as an industry have been doing this for a long time, but in its current technological innovation iteration, for about 5 or 7 years, we've been building these platforms out. So there's a lot of lessons to learn from it. Now, to look at let's call it the human side of it, right? So hopefully, at this point, just to check in, we have an idea of why we're worried about platforms. That being that we want our application developers, more importantly, our business, to live that dream of being able to rely on their software as the way they not only run their business, whether it's customer facing or internal facing, but the way that they make their business better, right? Optimizing, measuring all that mayonnaise and things like that, but then the way they also innovate their business and they change their business, right? For example, the example I always like to think about when it comes to innovating your business is there are many insurance companies out there, some who have achieved the following, but some who would like to do things like sell 24-hour insurance. You have a very expensive phone or something, and you want to go to the beach for a day, and you're worried you might ruin it, like I did at some point by sitting in the nice warm surf and forgetting that you had a phone in your pocket. So you want to buy some insurance for 24 hours in case you do that. Now, this is a great type of new business for an insurance company that is almost completely driven by software and the ability for those developers to do that kind of measuring the mayonnaise style development that I was talking about. And then you're interested in a platform to support that, but it's actually possible, if you have, something like a Kubernetes Impossible to get beyond that blinking cursor, and you want to build up a platform and the practices to support that kind of that dream of making sure I can buy a new phone if I sit in the ocean. I guess I think about that too much. But so now we looked a little bit about what the stack is, right? What's in a platform. And I think the other thing to consider is the human side of things, the meat stack, I guess, the meatware that you have on top of the software. Now, this is from one of my coworkers, Darren Rice, who worked at another large bank. He works with us now. And he has a kind of a good analysis of how you transform or change how the operations people think about what they're doing, right? And, I'm not going to read over all of these, but you can start to see how the notion of service delivery, right? Delivering a service and how people go about doing their job, how it kind of changes over to a more product approach, right? A way of more thinking about the customers you have and evolving the way that you work day to day, right? And a lot of this has been covered over the years, right? A lot of the type of thinking that you'll see from the DevOps world, the kind of, as they would say, the culture, the processes that move there. A lot of it comes from that. And if you're familiar with the DevOps way of thinking, it's kind of very similar to that, the evolved way of doing that. But this is more of kind of like something for management to consider, is thinking through, if we're moving, for example, to cite one of the most almost boring, but at the beginning, very important ways of thinking about it, right? As I was talking about earlier, the way that you tend to interact with the people using your service, the customers, is you interact more directly with them. You try to automate the requests that they have, just to like stand up a developer environment. You try to have a more human way of interacting with them through, whether it's using Slack or Matter or whatever sort of chat systems that you have. You work collaboratively with them. I don't know how else you would work with someone, I guess, forcefully, but you go over the plans that you have, the roadmaps that you have with them, rather than just getting like a big document of the capabilities that they need, doing the planning and delivering it to them every 6 or 12 months and just hoping that works out for them. But you're actually working with them again in a product-based way. And this changes a lot of the thinking and the things that your people do day to day. Now, not necessarily captured on here. I'll have to make a note to add this next time. But that is also important, and you hear a lot about, is, as you're building this platform out, you can imagine that you're not only operating it, but you're also, to a degree, sometimes you do a little bit of what feels like programming. You certainly do a lot of programming through configuring things, through integrating the different components together and establishing how things are packaged and how they're deployed, how you instrument things. So there is, I think you could call it generally programming, like platform programming that goes in. It may not seem like application development programming, but the job of the platform engineer comes down to specifying kind of what that platform is, and to a certain degree programming it, right? Like just as one example, one of the key things that a platform does, a full platform stack, is it has a good default baseline specification of how an application will be monitored and managed in production. And to choose one simple example, this is a good test to see how much platform engineering you're doing. If you look at 50, 500, or 10,000 applications, find out, I guess you can't do this with 10,000, but just ask the question, if I needed to get the logs for that application for the last 6 hours, would I be able to do that? Would I know how to go get those logs? And then once I did have those logs, would I know how to look through those logs to troubleshoot any problem that I had? And so that's a very small example of an area that, for example, a platform engineer spends time on. That is, with really good platform engineering, a really good platform in place, the answer to that is yes, I can get those logs because all of the developers or the majority of them, I've set up the mechanism, I've set up the template, the defaults for the type of application they're doing of how logs are retrieved, how they're sent out and retrieved. And, that's why, for example, that's one example of why Kubernetes has been so helpful with advancing platform engineering is a lot of those, the architecture of those defaults and the way things are packaged, deployed, the way components talk with each other, the way you find logs, the way they're managed in production. Kubernetes really seeks to standardize how to do that a lot more than previous platforms have. So the next, and this gets to the point of a problem that I come across all the time, which is many times people stand up their infrastructure, their, whether it's just cloud stuff or a Kubernetes install, or they've built a platform like this. And then I hear from them several months later and they say, but no one's using it. Like we set up this great stuff and the developers didn't actually come around. We sent out the email. We may have even like put some mandatory training in there that they had to do, but then they're not actually using the platform very much. And the reason this is, and again, this is a learning that you get from being on the kind of the sell side, if you will, from being selling software, is that, you have to do marketing, right? And that may seem like a bonkers word to use in the IT department for infrastructure and operations people. But really, you have to drive awareness. You've got to drive like not only training, but you also have to persuade developers to use your platform. And even if they're forced to use your platform, right? Even if they have no option, you want them to want to use their platform so that they do the best at it, right? So that even if to save yourself, they actually learn the details of how to do it. They want to spend time with it. They're curious about it. They're interested in doing a good job, right? Versus like, being forced to not try things out. I know that like, I don't really like filing my expenses or the system that we use. So when something goes wrong, I don't really spend a lot of time to figure out what I should have done. I just like open up a ticket or go ask someone, right? And instead, if I really liked the system that we use to follow our expenses and I thought the policy was great, I'd probably spend more time making it work on my own and being more genuine to it rather than asking for help. But that's kind of a cynical way of thinking about it. More important is that you're building this community, this ecosystem around your platform. And there are other benefits. I was talking with my friends at Mercedes who have run a platform for 7 years like this. One of the things that they noted is that as you extend that platform out, you add more services to it, you add more programming languages that you're supporting eventually, and think about this for an open source project as well. You as a platform team are not going to have the ability or the time to add all those additional things on top of it. You want your community, your developer community inside your company to also add things to it, to suggest better ways of doing things, right? You want them to be involved and be part of the development of that platform, contribute things to it in the same way that they would contribute things to the frameworks and the languages and the projects that they like and they enjoy using. So what this amounts to is one of my teammates, Deshaun, the guy who worked at Garmin, he has a funny way of saying this. He asks people who are working on this platform, he says, do you have a name for it? Do you have a name for your platform yet? And what he means by that is that one of the first things when it comes to building out a community, to doing this marketing, is you build out a brand, right? And you can see how companies have done that here, from an insurance company like Allstate in the States, to Mercedes, who has a lot of branding around it, a name for it, to Duke Energy, a big power company, a big utility company in the States, to British Telco or BT, and on and on and on. Many of the companies who are successful at putting a platform in place, they come up with a brand, a set of marketing. And they also have at least one, if not multiple, platform advocates. These are really people like myself. I'm on a developer relations team who their only job is to raise awareness about the platform, tell people about that. But then also what they do, because they go out and they talk with the developers, the people using the platform, they become a feedback mechanism as well to go back to the platform team and help them understand the developers and their needs and finely tune that platform, right? They're starting to be the outreach people, the marketing, if that word doesn't turn you off very much, around the platform, in addition to like training sessions and things like that. And just to really drive this point home, right? So here's another, you can go, this recording actually, even though we did this earlier this week, the recording's now available if you want to go look at it. But this is from the Mercedes presentation, and it's a good collection of all of those kind of, let's call it community management, the way that they work with the developers, the way the platform team works with the developers, right? And you can see here, kind of like, with the internal resources and other things. Some of this has to do with the internal developer platform, the intranet for developers that they're putting in place. But a lot of it is down to like literally how you're talking with, how you're communicating with the developers, how you're integrating them into the process that you have, the product development of that. And again, I know I keep emphasizing this over and over again, but that's a major shift, as I said at the beginning, is that you're working directly with developers. And I think also something that I think is worth exploring a lot, that developers are also working with operations people, which I almost think that it's a little harder to get application developers to work with operations people. I'm not quite sure why. It's something I want to study a lot more, but I feel like I go and tell operations, or I suggest to operations people that they work with developers. And very often they say, we've tried, and they don't really return our emails or anything like that. So I think there's a bi-directional relationship that needs a lot of focus. But once you get into this state and you're putting these things in place, like Mercedes here, like JP Morgan Chase, like BT, Allstate, various, like many organizations that we work with that have been doing this over time. You get into the state where you have that platform in place that can run, just does the basic of running your applications, but supports that dream of measuring the mayonnaise or enabling measuring the mayonnaise, where your developers can focus pretty purely on not only writing their software, but also releasing it quickly, but more importantly, studying what their customers are doing and iteratively going through and learning how to best solve that problem so that all the way back to the organization, you can start to program the business. And not only do things faster is not exactly the right word, but you can start to solve the problems that you have, I think, a lot better and even a lot faster than if you were doing things in a more traditional way. So if that all sounds good, what are some tips on getting started, right? I always find that like a lot of the stuff that I went over so far is a lot about the final destination, I guess, we're past Halloween, so we don't need any horror movie illusions. But a lot of it is the desired what state, not the how to get there. And I think it's the getting started point that can be the most difficult to getting into. So I just want to go over a few things to kind of help bootstrap you into getting a platform in place. So the first one is both expectation setting and then also a very important tactic that I see over and over again. And that is that you want to start as small as possible. And what I mean by as small as possible is that you want to not just build your entire platform all at once and then go to the application developers and tell them that you have it, but you want to first pick one application out of the entire portfolio in your organization, maybe 2 or 3, but I would start with one and find an application that you want to move to this new platform, right? That you want to move probably to a container-based architecture. That is, you want to find an application that will run on Kubernetes, unless you're using something like a Cloud Foundry, in which case it's a little easier, but you're finding a container-based architecture of an application. So find one of these applications, and you find it by being technically feasible, as I was saying, but also something that actually is business-facing, that has value to the business, but not too much. You don't want it to be a core application that if something goes wrong, it's going to ruin your business, right? Like your core banking. And instead, in the area of banking, for example, you might find an ATM locator application, which is a great example application. It has no customer data to worry about. It's a small application that's technically feasible to kind of do anything with, but it actually is a pretty important part of your business, right? People need to find ATMs so that they can interact with your bank. I know I need to find ATMs every now and then when I need actual cash to pay someone, which doesn't happen that much. But you can also think of store locators to look up the hours, reservation systems, whatever it may be. Depending on the size of your company, it could be all sorts of things. Worker scheduling thing for factory floors, whatever. But find an application like that and use that as the way where you learn what needs to be in your platform, where you learn what components should be there, where you learn how to work with developers. And as you learn how to work with developers, what you need from your platform team, again, in this kind of low risk, but actually real environment, right? A couple of things will happen. One, you'll learn what works and what doesn't work. Two, you're going to build up at first a very small set, but then as you move to 2, 3, 5, 20 more projects, as you kind of go up this slow curve, as I was saying, you're going to build up internal skills, not only with your platform engineers, but also with application developers who know how those things operate, right? Like they know and trust how to use this new way of doing development, how to use this new platform. And then you identify a few of the people, a few of those application developers, and who kind of like can work with people, and you seed them into new teams. So as you bring new teams on, you can send these application developers, whether it's permanent or a temporary assignment, to a new team to help that team out. Similarly, as you get platform engineers who are pretty good at working with other people, you can send them out in a consultative role to these new application development teams to help them learn how to run on the platform. And then finally, especially if you're in management as you're scaling it, the other thing that becomes key to this way of starting slow is that you're building up, again, to use this word, internal marketing, right? So at some point, you're going to have to go to a large meeting with executives and not only ask for more budget and resources and permission, really, to pursue getting more and more applications on your platform, but you're going to have to start as a manager, as an executive, convincing your peers that this platform would be good for them to use. Now, whatever the politics of your situation may be, you always have to be aware that other businesses, other organizations may not be so interested in using your way of doing something, and they need to be convinced that it's a good way of doing it. So someone like myself from an external vendor, we can come in with all of our, flashy, great presentations and good old silver-tongued ways of saying stuff and try to persuade people to do it. But, people can be suspicious of vendors. Definitely not of VMware people, but some of the other vendors out there might be a little too like Odysseus in the way they go over stuff. So you're a little jaded about vendors telling you stuff. Not everything, but some things. But if you've built up this internal marketing force, these internal case studies, it gets a little easier to convince the organization that this way of operating is better. And again, I see this over and over again at organizations, and you can see that the time scale can kind of stretch out. Just to set expectations, it's going to be a number of years. I was talking with someone earlier this week, and we kind of agreed that it would take about 2 years to get this in place before you kind of have achieved escape velocity, that the rest of your organization is going to achieve enough momentum that they're going to eventually be moving on to this platform way of doing stuff. I mean, you'll have many applications in the meantime, but it kind of takes like a year or two to get to the point where you could say this program's been successful and it's going to become the official thing that you're going to do. So then the other thing to do to get started, again, think about developers as your customers and the problem that developers are trying to solve. You're not solving their problems, right, about measuring the mayonnaise, but you're solving the problem they have of getting their software out the door, right? Not only just building the software, packaging it, and deploying it, but also making sure that their software can run in production. It has the performance characteristics you want, like finding the logs, as I mentioned. But there are other stakeholders, other bottlenecks of awesomeness they have to get through. Their software has to be compliant. So it has to match only not industry regulations, but also just your own regulations and enterprise architecture compliance. It has to be secure. I mean, at least one would hope so. So you have to pass the security policies that you have. You have to have attestation of who built stuff, and you've got to make sure that you have your bill of materials, on and on and on, right? So there's a lot of governance and compliance and security things that developers need to go through. And providing those kinds of things, right, is also a large part of what you're providing for the developers. So in short, I think not only are you providing the runtime environment and the integrated backing services, the middleware, but you're also providing, one of the other things you're providing is what people nowadays are at the moment like to call a golden path, right? Like the best way, the easiest way to get things to production, to satisfy all those needs, all those kind of like secondary, like functional pipeline needs that developers have, in addition to the kind of like runtime things they need, the frameworks and just getting their applications into production. So getting an understanding of what that whole path to production looks like. That is not only a good first step, but that is a very required first step, right? And you might think you know what these things are, but I would suggest scheduling maybe half a day or so, get a big clear whiteboard or, a Miro board or whatever if you're doing it online, get some application developers, get some release managers, the infrastructure people, and just kind of brainstorm out what all of these boxes and arrows look like. And more than likely, you'll find all sorts of boxes and arrows you didn't know exist. And if you really want to scare yourself, go through and don't focus on the boxes, but just go through and write down how long it usually takes to go through each of those arrows, what the bottlenecks are, the wait time to each of those things. And that's going to give you a good roadmap of things to start on and things to start optimizing, but also the activities that the developers do and therefore what you can help them with. And then finally, if you want to get very specific, right? And I think this is a nice, tactical, concrete thing you can do to start with, is you can send out, even at the beginning, this is a very customer product manager thing to do. You can send out developer toil audits, right? And this is a way, if you remember those arrows from the previous slide and timing the wait time, a lot of the time, those arrows include a lot of developer toil. And this is borrowed from the site reliability engineering definition of toil. It's repetitive tasks that are often manual tasks that don't really add much value, so to speak, much benefit to the end product that could be automated, right? Or it might also be misunderstandings and slipped communication things. But I would suggest what you do is you put together a developer toil audit, which is basically a survey of some standardized questions. You send out an initial one of that. You do a little bit of work. Maybe 2 or 4 weeks later, you might send out the same survey again and see if you've improved. And you send that out on what interval makes sense to not only see if you're improving what these toil things are, but it also, as a product manager, the people product managing the platform, it allows you to very easily find and rank and therefore prioritize the features that you're building in the platform. If you're familiar with Scrum and Agile and just the way people talk about development nowadays, you're prioritizing the backlog of stories that you have. And the reason is because most all of these questions ask developers to rate them on a scale of 1 to 5 of the worst, a Likert scale. And so, through the magic of Likert scaling, you can basically load that all into a spreadsheet and just do, sort by ascending. And then you have a pretty good start for figuring out what your backlog is going to be in each period that you send this audit out. Now, once again, you can actually do this pretty easily. There's a report that I worked on with a couple of people going over this technique, and I think there's actually just a spreadsheet you can import into Microsoft Forms or the Google Survey thing or whatever, so you can start to do this developer toil audit. And again, it'll give you a sense of what to start with when you have those things there. So with that, hopefully I've given you a sense of what a platform is, if you hear this phrase, platform engineering is, or platform as a product, what the point of that is and why there's so much interest and value in it now. And again, the most important thing is that thinking about the application developers as your customer, if you were to build a platform for them, if you were to build stuff for them, what would you build for them so that they could accomplish their job much better? We went over all sorts of things there in the middle, but I think a great way to start is just to ask them to send out these surveys, the developer toil survey, and start to find out what they're struggling with, and then you can start to figure out things for your platform to put in place. So I catalog a lot of the stuff in this area so far. There's not very much at the moment, but hopefully I'll find more if you go to cote.io/platform, or if you don't mind QR codes, you can follow that one there. And with that, thanks for attending and checking this out, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Do we have questions?
I think I have.
Okay, so let me a little bit prepare. That's very good. Where are you from?
I'm from Poland.
From where?
Poland.
Poland. Witamy, tak? I'm not sure. Does it work?
It looks like it's working.
But you need to speak a little bit louder, okay?
I can do this. Hello.
Hello.
You said something that's very curious. You said that as a platform engineer, you have very hard time reaching the developers because they are inaccessible and they don't reply your emails, right? And it's generally that rift that the developers are hard to contact with. Funnily enough, I often have the same feeling, but in reverse. So, so it's good. I think it's a good place to start mutual understanding. As a platform engineer, what's the most important stuff that you want to have from the application developers? How could we help you in your work?
Wait, so can you ask that again? Like, as who's trying to help who in this instance?
So I'm an application developer, and
All
I'd
right.
like to help you in your job probably by being a better developer. What's the most important part for you?
Well, I think for a platform engineer to advise an application developer about, just to make sure I have it right. Yeah, I mean, I think what I often see. Well, I think what it comes down to is understanding. Let's pick one example. I think that's interesting. And the general version of that is to think about what are the, let's say, infrastructure and operations implications of the architectures that application developers pick, right? So an application developer, I mean, again, if everything is perfect and you're doing a great job, problems don't exist so much, right? But sometimes, probably often, an application developer will choose an architecture or a design for something that solves the problems they have from an application perspective. But they're not always thinking about what that means, for example, about the costs of running the application, right? So there are many architectures you could use that are fast, that allow you to have low latency and serve up the applications, make the experience of using your application better. But there's been some recent commentary, because there's a lot of interest in FinOps and managing cloud costs, that the architectures developers are choosing actually cause a lot of the cost in running cloud, right? So the counterintuitive thing there being, for better or worse, counterintuitive stuff can be annoying, but the oversight being that a lot of people think the way that you control cloud costs is you find wasted resources. But the consultants who work on that often say that really it's the architectures, the choices developers have been making that raise the cost of things, right? Whether it's, they're not handling data management as much as they can, so there's a lot of network traffic, or they have to spin up a lot of instances of things instead of kind of minimizing what they have, all sorts of stuff like that, right? So I think that's an example of having a more bi-directional conversation where, if you do sort of an architectural review with a platform engineer, they might help point out areas where running things this way is going to end up costing us a lot or be very hard to diagnose. And, I think that's some feedback application developers can take from them. And it might be a nice way to start working. And then also the application developer can start to explain what it is they do, why they made these architectural choices, how things work. I don't know, a good way to build up empathy is to kind of learn from each other, which something like that does. So I don't know, maybe that's one example.
Thank you. That was very telling answer.
Great.
All right. So, Michael, thank you once again. It was a pleasure to have you, and hopefully see you for next year in Build Stuff.
Yeah, that'd be great. Well, thanks again for having me. It was a good time.
Have a good day. Well, it's already evening, right? And where you are?
Yep. Well, more or less. I don't know. It's 3:55. Does that count as evening? I think in a month or so it will
Not
be.
Not that bad. So have a good evening. Have a good evening and also a weekend.
You as well. Bye.
Bye.